The first time someone tried to kick in my front door, I wasn't even inside the house. I was standing across the street with a paper cup of burnt gas station coffee in one hand and my father's folded American flag tucked under my arm, watching three strangers drill a bright orange notice onto my porch like they'd done it 100 times before. Funny thing is, nobody looked nervous except me. They acted like they owned the place. They didn't. They just thought they did. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 46 years old. I inspect bridges for the state of Colorado, and until last spring I believed that if you minded your business, paid your bills, and treated people with respect, life usually returned the favor. My dad used to say, most problems can be solved by patience and paperwork. Turns out he was only half right. Sometimes paperwork isn't enough. Sometimes you have to make people choke on the very rules they hide behind. It all started the week after my father died. Dad had lived in Aspen Ridge Estates for almost 28 years. It wasn't a fancy neighborhood, just one of those quiet suburban communities where everyone waved while walking their dogs, kids rode bikes until sunset, and retirees argued about whose tomatoes grew faster every summer. The kind of place that looked peaceful from the outside. Looks can fool you. After his funeral, I stayed behind for 3 extra days to help my aunt settle family matters. My father's old pickup was still parked in the driveway when I finally drove back home. I remember pulling into the neighborhood just before sunset, seeing the mountains glowing orange in the distance, and thinking maybe the hardest part was finally over. I couldn't have been more wrong. There was a notice taped across my front door. Property access suspended pending community compliance review. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous my brain refused to process it. I walked up the steps, reached for the doorknob. Nothing. The lock had been changed. For a second I honestly wondered if I had walked to the wrong house. Grief does strange things to your head. Then I noticed my dad's old wind chime still hanging from the porch, the tiny crack in the third brick beside the garage, the bird feeder he'd insisted attracted smarter birds than the neighbors. No, this was my house. Someone had changed my locks. My neighbor across the street, Mr. Halpin, opened his garage halfway before spotting me. He froze like a teenager caught sneaking in after curfew. "Ethan, you know anything about this?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I figured somebody called you." "Nobody called me," he sighed. "They came yesterday." "Who?" "The HOA. That was the first time I heard the name Clea Morgan. Apparently she'd become HOA president while I was helping Dad through chemotherapy over the previous year. According to Mr. Halpin, she believed the neighborhood had become too relaxed. That sentence should have been my warning. I ended up sleeping inside my truck that night because every locksmith in town had closed hours earlier. People love talking about grief like it's dramatic crying in the rain. Sometimes grief is much quieter. Sometimes it's sitting in the driver's seat of a Ford F-150 at 2 in the morning, staring at the porch light your father installed 15 years ago, wondering how your life somehow became so unbelievably stupid. The next morning I walked straight into the HOA office. Clea Morgan looked exactly like someone who ironed her jeans. Everything about her was perfect. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. Perfect little silver nameplate sitting on her desk. She didn't stand when I walked in. "You must be Mr. Walker. You changed the locks on my house. We secured the property. My property. There were concerns." "What concerns?" She folded her hands together. "We received reports that the home had been abandoned. I buried my father 6 days ago. I'm very sorry for your loss." She didn't sound sorry, not even a little. But community standards require occupied homes to remain maintained. I stared at her. "I'm standing here. You are now." That sentence landed harder than she realized. For a moment I thought about yelling. Instead, I asked who authorized changing my locks. The Architectural Compliance Committee. I'd like their names. They're confidential. I'd like the paperwork. It's being processed. I'd like a copy. You'll receive one in the mail. I nodded slowly. People think staying calm means you've given up. Engineers know better. When a bridge starts making strange noises, you don't panic. You start collecting data. I walked out without another word. Clea smiled as I left. Big mistake. Back at the county records office, an older clerk named Donna listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned closer over the counter. Honey, nobody had called me that since my mother died. Bring me the address. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying a thick binder. Your subdivision filed its original covenants in 1994. She flipped through several pages before stopping. There, I read the paragraph 3 times. The HOA had authority to issue fines. They could suspend amenities. They could place liens after legal procedures. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it authorize changing a homeowner's locks. I looked back up. So, Donna smiled. So somebody got real creative. Driving home, I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. 3 houses on the next block had for sale signs. 2 more sat completely empty. An elderly woman struggled to pull weeds while reading what looked suspiciously like a violation notice. A young couple argued quietly beside the driveway over a stack of envelopes. Nobody looked angry, they looked tired. That's different. Angry people fight. Tired people surrender. That evening, someone knocked on my truck window while I was eating takeout Chinese in my driveway. It was the elderly woman. She held out a folder almost 2 inches thick. My name's Elena Brooks. Her voice shook just enough to tell me she'd practiced this conversation. I heard what happened. You did. The whole neighborhood did. She glanced toward the HOA office down the street before lowering her voice. You're the first person who's come back. I frowned. What do you mean? They usually leave. She handed me the folder. Inside were dozens of violation letters, photographs, certified mail receipts, handwritten notes. Every page documented another complaint: fence color, mailbox height, flower pots, holiday decorations. Some fines were $25, others reached nearly $1,000. I've lived here 22 years, Elena whispered. My husband built that rose garden before he passed away. Clea fined me because the flowers attract too many bees. I looked up. You appealed. I tried. What happened? Elena gave a sad little laugh. The appeal barred was Clea, her sister, and her boyfriend. I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't bureaucracy. This wasn't about neighborhood rules. This was something else, something much uglier. I looked back at the stack of documents in my lap, then at the quiet street where curtains moved ever so slightly as neighbors watched from behind their windows. People weren't hiding from me. They were waiting to see if I'd do exactly what everyone else had done. Pack up. Sell cheap. Disappear. I closed the folder. No, I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else. Elena tilted her head. What? I looked toward my father's front porch where someone else's lock still hung from my front door. They picked the wrong engineer. The funny thing about engineers is that people assume we're good with numbers. We are, but that's not really what separates us from everyone else. We notice patterns, tiny ones, the kind most people walk past every single day. By the end of that week, I wasn't looking at violation letters anymore. I was looking at a blueprint. Somebody had designed this system, and systems always leave fingerprints. The next morning, I spread Elena's paperwork across my father's old dining room table after finally getting a locksmith to restore access to my own house. Every envelope, every fine, every inspection notice went into neat little piles. Dates, addresses, dollar amounts, reasons for violations. By lunchtime, I stopped reading words and started drawing lines. The same streets kept showing up: corner lots, Large backyards, homes owned by retirees, properties without mortgages. I leaned back in my chair. No way. I opened the county property database and began checking ownership records. One house had sold 18 months ago. Another sold 11 months ago. A third sold just after Christmas. Different sellers, different buyers, until I looked one page deeper. Each buyer had eventually transferred ownership to the same investment company, Evergreen Residential Holdings. I'd never heard of it. But when I searched the business registration, one familiar name appeared near the bottom of the filing. Clea Morgan, not as owner, as managing partner. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably careless. People committing fraud usually hide it better than that. Apparently, Clea had spent so many years convincing frightened homeowners they were powerless that she'd stopped worrying about anyone checking the paperwork. I printed everything. Then I printed it again. Dad used to tell me, always keep one copy for yourself and one for the person who's about to lie. By Friday afternoon, my kitchen looked less like a house and more like a detective's office. Maps covered the walls. Sticky notes connected addresses. Property records filled cardboard boxes. Then someone knocked on my door, not politely. 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 more. When I opened it, a tall man in paint-covered work boots stood on my porch holding a 6-pack of root beer. "You Ethan?" "Depends," he smiled. "I'm Noah Ramirez." I waited. "My wife said I should probably introduce myself before you accidentally think I'm with the HOA. That made me smile for the first time all week. He pointed across the street. "We bought the gray house last year." "Oh." "My wife bakes when she's nervous. I drink root beer. I appreciate the honesty." He looked over my shoulder at the mountain of paperwork. "So, you're actually doing it." "Doing what?" "Fighting back." I shrugged. "I'm trying to understand what's happening." "No," he said quietly. "You're doing something none of us had the stomach to do." He stepped inside. For nearly 3 hours we compared stories. His family had been fined because their son's wheelchair ramp wasn't architecturally compatible. Even though the city had approved it, Clea demanded they replace it, at their expense. When Noah refused, inspections suddenly became weekly. Grass, fence, trash cans, holiday lights, it never stopped. "I almost sold," he admitted. "My wife cried for 2 months. I looked around the room. "How many people?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, "Depends." "On what?" "How many are brave enough to admit they were bullied?" Saturday morning the group grew from 2 people to 6. Elena brought homemade muffins. Noah arrived carrying a laptop. A retired accountant named Harold showed up with HOA financial statements he'd quietly downloaded before resigning from the finance committee. Then came Maya. She couldn't have been older than 30. Freckles, running shoes, coffee the size of a flower pot. "I'm an investigative reporter." I blinked. "You work for Channel 8. Used to. What happened?" I asked too many questions. I liked her immediately. She looked around the room. "So, who's the villain?" Nobody answered. Instead, I slid the property records across the table. 20 minutes later, she looked up slowly. "Holy. Yeah, this isn't an HOA story. I know. This is organized property acquisition. I know. They're using violations to pressure people into distressed sales. I know." She leaned back. "You've been busy." "No." I looked at the wall covered in documents. "They've been busy." For the next several days, our little kitchen turned into mission control. Harold audited every expense. Noah interviewed former homeowners. Elena remembered names everyone else had forgotten. Maya filed public records requests like she was ordering coffee. The more we dug, the uglier it became. Consulting contracts paid to companies that didn't exist. Landscaping invoices larger than the community's annual budget. Emergency legal fees with no lawsuits attached. Thousands of dollars moving through accounts nobody could explain. Then Harold found something that made the room go completely silent. He adjusted his glasses twice before speaking. Clea's been paying herself. How? Management consulting. She's the HOA president. I know. How much? He swallowed. Over $300,000 in 4 years. Nobody said anything. Elena quietly sat down. Noah looked toward the window. I stared at the spreadsheet. $300,000. You don't accidentally steal $300,000. That's a business model. Late Tuesday afternoon, another envelope appeared on my front porch. Violation notice. Reason: unauthorized document storage visible through residential windows. I laughed so hard coffee came out my nose. She had literally fined me for having paperwork. No warning. No inspection. Just another attempt to remind me she was watching. I folded the notice and slipped it into a growing binder labeled Evidence Against Clea Morgan. Sometimes your enemy is kind enough to organize your case for you. Wednesday evening my phone rang. Unknown number. This is Ethan, a woman's voice whispered. They're talking about you. Who is this? I can't say. Okay. They had a meeting tonight. What meeting? The real one. My grip tightened. They're planning something. What? A long pause. They can't make you sell. My heart skipped. But they think they can make you leave. The line went dead. I called back, disconnected. For the next hour I sat on the porch thinking about those words. Make you leave, not sell. Leave. There was a difference. One was financial, the other was personal. The next morning I found out exactly what she meant. Every utility company I used had received complaints. Noise complaints, safety complaints, anonymous reports. The building department suddenly wanted inspections. Fire prevention requested access. Code enforcement left 2-door tags. Animal control somehow received a report that I owned an aggressive dog. I didn't even own a dog. By noon, 4 different government agencies had contacted me. Separate departments, separate complaints, same timing. Clea had figured something out. She couldn't legally force me out, but she could bury me under enough inconvenience that I'd eventually give up. It was actually a clever strategy if you weren't paying attention. That afternoon Maya looked at me over her laptop. You know what scares her? No. The truth isn't what scares people like Clea. What does? She smiled. Witnesses. At exactly 6 that evening, every person in our little group stood on my front lawn while Noah installed 6 new security cameras. Perfectly legal, perfectly visible. Each one pointed only at my own property. Each one backed up automatically to cloud storage. Clea drove past 3 times before sunset. She never stopped. She didn't have to. We both understood the message. Mine was simple. I'm recording everything now. Hers came an hour later. Another envelope, another violation. Reason: excessive surveillance creating community discomfort. I looked up at camera number 3. The tiny green light blinked quietly in the evening sun. For the first time since my father died, I smiled. Because people only panic when they realize they're about to lose control. And judging by how desperate Clea Morgan was becoming, she knew exactly what we were about to find. The thing about bullies is they almost never stop on their own. They keep pushing until they finally hit something that won't move. Clea Morgan had spent years believing she was the strongest person in Aspen Ridge Estates. She wasn't prepared for someone who treated every threat like another piece of evidence. Friday morning started with the sound of tires crunching across my driveway. 3 SUVs, 1 pickup truck, 6 people wearing matching polo shirts stepped onto my lawn carrying clipboards. Right behind them came Clea. She smiled like she'd already won. Good morning, Mr. Walker. Morning. We're conducting a comprehensive community compliance inspection. I don't remember requesting one. You didn't. I figured. She looked toward the cameras mounted beneath my roofline. You've certainly invested in security. I sleep better that way. I'm sure you do. The 6 inspectors spread across my property. One measured my fence, another photographed my mailbox. A third examined my flower beds like they contained nuclear waste. Meanwhile, camera 1, camera 2, camera 3 captured every second. 20 minutes later, one of the inspectors approached Clea and quietly whispered something in her ear. She frowned. He whispered again. This time she looked annoyed. Finally, she walked over. "Your property appears," she hesitated, "to be in compliance. I know. We'll continue inspecting. Take your time." They spent another 40 minutes searching for something, anything, nothing. When they finally left, Maya laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. "She just paid 6 inspectors to prove you're following every rule." I smiled. Expensive mistake. By Monday morning, our investigation was complete. Harold had reconstructed nearly 5 years of financial records. Noah had interviewed 12 former homeowners. Elena had collected handwritten statements from 7 current residents. Maya had uncovered something none of us expected. Evergreen Residential Holdings wasn't just buying houses. It already owned 11 of them. 11. Inside one neighborhood. Enough to influence elections. Enough to manipulate property values. Enough to control the HOA forever. "This isn't about neighborhood rules," Maya said quietly. "It's about building a monopoly." That afternoon, she published the first article. The headline spread across social media faster than any of us imagined. HOA president linked to secret property acquisition scheme. By sunset, 3 television stations had called. Tuesday morning, the county attorney requested copies of our evidence. Wednesday, everything exploded. State investigators arrived at the HOA office before 9. By 10, accountants were carrying out boxes. At 11, Clea's attorney showed up. At noon, she came to my house alone, no photographers, no inspectors, no fake confidence. She stood on my porch looking 10 years older than the woman I'd met 2 weeks earlier. "I'd like to talk." I stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind me. "What about?" "This has gone too far," I almost laughed. "It went too far when you changed my locks." She looked away. "I made mistakes." "No. You don't understand the pressure." "I understand perfectly," she sighed. "You've embarrassed me." I stared at her. "My father died. You embarrassed yourself." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she asked the question I'd been expecting. "What do you want?" It surprised me how quickly the answer came. "I don't want your money. I can settle. I don't want your house. I'll resign. I don't want revenge." She looked genuinely confused. "Then what?" "I want every family who left because of you to know they weren't crazy." She blinked. "I want the people who stayed scared for years to stop looking over their shoulders." She didn't answer. "And I want you to hear this exactly once." I stepped a little closer. "You confused authority with ownership." The words seemed to hit harder than I intended. She lowered her eyes. Without another sentence, she walked back to her car. That was the last private conversation we ever had. 3 months later, the hearings began. They lasted nearly 2 weeks. Former homeowners testified, contractors testified, bank employees testified. Even 2 former HOA board members admitted they had approved documents without reading them because they trusted Clea. One by one, the picture became impossible to deny. Misused association funds, conflicts of interest, fraudulent contracts, selective enforcement, property manipulation. The investigation expanded beyond the HOA. Evergreen Residential Holdings dissolved before the end of the year. Several civil lawsuits followed. Families who had sold under pressure received financial settlements. The neighborhood elected an entirely new board. Not a single previous officer remained. The first meeting lasted almost 4 hours. You know what everyone argued about? Not lawsuits, not revenge, not politics. They debated whether the community playground needed another swing. I remember smiling to myself. That sounded like a neighborhood again. 6 months after everything ended, Elena invited everyone to her backyard. The roses were blooming, the same roses she'd once been fined for growing. Children chased each other between the flower beds while Noah grilled burgers. Harold somehow managed to explain accounting using hot dogs. Nobody understood him. We all laughed anyway. At one point Maya walked over carrying 2 paper plates. "You know," she said, "people online think this story is fake." "Really? They say no HOA president would ever push things this far." I looked around the yard, Elena laughing with neighbors, kids running through the grass. My father's old flag folded carefully inside a display case visible through the living room window. "I hope they're right," she looked at me. "I really do. Because if people think stories like this couldn't possibly happen, maybe it means fewer communities are living through them. Maybe that's progress, or maybe people simply underestimate how dangerous a little unchecked power can become. Every now and then someone asks whether all the stress was worth it, whether I would have been happier just selling the house and moving somewhere else. Honestly, there were nights when I almost did. Grief makes you tired. Conflict makes you question yourself. There were moments I wondered if peace was worth more than principle. Then I remember something my father told me years ago while we were repairing an old wooden fence together. He said, "Son, if you let one crooked post stay because fixing it feels like too much work, eventually the whole fence leans." Back then I thought he was talking about carpentry. Turns out he was talking about people. Aspen Ridge Estates isn't perfect today. No neighborhood is. People still argue about fences, trash cans, parking, holiday decorations. That's life. The difference is, now they argue in public meetings, with open records, with votes everyone can see, without fear. And every time I walk past my front porch, I still notice the tiny scratches around the old lock that someone illegally installed after my father's funeral. I never repaired them, not because I couldn't, because they're a reminder. Sometimes the strongest thing you can build isn't made from steel or concrete. Sometimes it's a community that finally refuses to stay silent. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a landlord, a city office, or anyone who abused a little bit of authority, I'd genuinely like to hear your story. Do you think Clea deserved everything that happened to her? Or do you think Ethan should have accepted an apology and moved on? Let me know in the comments, because these situations are rarely as simple as they look from the outside. And if this story made you think about someone who needs a reminder to document everything and know their rights, share this video with them. You never know whose fight might change an entire neighborhood.